How did a single disputed treaty and a desperate migration end up sparking the absolute final armed native resistance to U.S. expansion in the Old Northwest? Well, let's dive into this explainer and explore the Black Hawk War of 1832. It was a brief but massively consequential conflict that literally changed the map of the United States forever. And as we're going to see, this wasn't just some standard clash of armies. No, it was a deeply tragic sequence of total misunderstandings, broken promises, and just unyielding territorial ambition.
Now, these words right here from Black Hawk, who was a highly respected Sauk war captain, they perfectly captured the deep-seated mistrust that ultimately lit the fuse on this whole devastating chain of events. He recognized a pattern, right? One that had been going on for decades. Treaties would get signed, sure, but the verbal agreements made around the council fires, they almost never actually matched the strict legal boundaries that ended up down on the page. And honestly, this fundamental, total breakdown in trust, that is the absolute core of our story today.
All right, moving into Section 1, the disputed 1804 Treaty. To really wrap our heads around this tragedy, we actually have to rewind 28 years to the root cause, $2,234.50. I mean, think about that. That incredibly paltry sum is what the U.S. paid up front for a staggering 50 million acres of Native American land. To put that into perspective, it's just an absurdly small amount for a massive expanse of territory east of the Mississippi. Basically, Territorial Governor William Henry Harrison negotiated this treaty with a small delegation of Sauk and Meskwaki men. But here's the kicker. Those men had originally just traveled to St. Louis to negotiate the release of some prisoners. They were absolutely not authorized by their full tribal councils to cede any land whatsoever. Yet somehow, on paper, they signed away millions of acres for this tiny upfront payment and a modest annual annuity.
So, while that 1804 treaty technically allowed the tribes to remain on their land until it was officially surveyed and sold off, the reality on the ground shifted dramatically and fast. In 1828, lead was discovered around Galena, Illinois. And you know how a gold rush works? Well, this was a lead rush. It brought a massive flood of impatient miners and white squatters right directly into the Sauk's ancestral homes, including their primary village, Saukenuk. Just imagine returning home from a long winter hunt only to find complete strangers literally occupying your house. That was the spark that really set the powder keg off. As you might expect, this crisis sparked just an agonizing division within the Sauk tribe itself. It's a classic split in strategy. On one side, we've got Keokuk pushing for pragmatic accommodation. He had actually traveled east, seen those massive, booming American cities, and basically concluded that fighting the U.S. was just a lost cause. So he urges his people to relocate to Iowa. But on the flip side, we have Black Hawk's fierce traditional resistance. Black Hawk firmly believed the 1804 treaty was a total fraud, start to finish, and he was absolutely determined to hold on to the village where he was born.
Okay, Section 2, Rise of the British Band. Let's jump ahead to 1832 and see how this tension boils over into direct conflict. After spending the winter gathering supporters, Black Hawk takes decisive action to reclaim his homeland. He leads a group known as the British Band, which, by the way, got its name from their past alliances with the British, right back across the Mississippi River into Illinois in April 1832. But look closely at the numbers here. Out of the roughly 1,100 people crossing back, 600 of them, that's 55%, were non-combatants. With that many women, children, and elderly folks, it becomes super clear that this was intended as a migration to plant corn. It was not a war party. I mean, you don't bring 600 non-combatants along if your main goal is to launch an immediate military offensive, right?
Which brings us to Section 3, Panic and Pursuit. Unfortunately, panicked U.S. officials and pretty undisciplined militiamen immediately assumed the absolute worst, kicking off this frantic and truly devastating pursuit. To the local settlers, any large movement of Native Americans was instantly seen as an existential threat, so the Illinois militia was swiftly mobilized. What started as a brief militia rout at a place called Stillman's Run very quickly turned into a grueling, starvation-plagued flight through the swamps of Wisconsin. After that initial clash, Black Hawk realized a hard truth. He had no broader Native or British support coming, and absolutely no provisions. The band was forced to flee north through some incredibly harsh terrain. Honestly, by the time they reached the Wisconsin Heights in July, the situation was so dire they were eating their own horses just to survive.
So I really want you to ask yourself, how in the world did a desperate, starving migration deteriorate so quickly into a horrific massacre? Well, it wasn't just a simple matter of a military pursuit. It was actually a persistent, fatal inability to communicate across the battle lines. Literally one of the most tragic communication breakdowns in history.
The answer really lies in these repeated, deeply tragic miscommunications. Basically, every single attempt by Black Hawk's band to surrender under a white flag was met with total confusion and ultimately gunfire. Look at the timeline. At Stillman's Run, Black Hawk sends emissaries carrying a white flag, and they're just captured and fired upon. Then, after Wisconsin Heights, a chief named Neopope tries to surrender in the middle of the night. But he spoke in Ho-Chunk, and the malicious translators had already packed up and left the camp, so nobody even understood him. And finally, when the starving band reaches the Mississippi River, they raise a white flag again, and it's completely ignored by an armed American steamboat. Every single off-ramp to peace was violently closed.
And that leads us to Section 4, the Bad Axe Massacre.
This brings us to a harrowing climax that really requires us to slow down and recognize the sheer gravity of what occurred. Today, this isn't remembered as a battle, it is rightly remembered as a massacre. On August 2nd, the situation reached its dreadful conclusion. Trapped between heavily armed troops commanded by General Henry Atkinson advancing from the rear and that steamboat, the Warrior, firing canister shot directly from the water, the British band literally had nowhere to run. The Warriors desperately tried to fight a rearguard action to buy time, while the women, children, and the elderly frantically tried to swim across the swift, dangerous currents of the Mississippi.
Major John Allen Wakefield was actually present that day, and his chilling words strip away any sort of romantic pioneer mythology about a heroic battle. Instead, they revealed a brutal, unvarnished reality of soldiers firing on fleeing men, women, and children. He documented his absolute horror at seeing the suffering of the innocent. And this is exactly why modern historians universally classify Bad Axe as a massacre. Soldiers systematically shot people in the water and on the islands, and tragically, many of those who did manage to make it to the other side were later hunted down by U.S. allied Sioux warriors.
When you look at the raw casualty numbers, it visually drives home just how incredibly lopsided and devastating this violence really was. Out of the roughly 1,100 people who originally crossed into Illinois with Black Hawk, about half of them perished. Compare that to the U.S. forces, who lost just 77 individuals. It wasn't just a defeat, it was an absolute decimation of the British band.
Now let's look at the aftermath in Section 5, Accelerated Westward Expansion.
Following the massacre, the war's conclusion dramatically, and I mean dramatically, accelerated the total removal of Native Americans from the Midwest. The U.S. government took this decisive, brutal victory and leveraged it to immediately push forward its broader expansionist agenda. And the way they did it followed a very specific, almost theatrical playbook. First, Black Hawk surrenders in late August, but then, in this totally bizarre paradox, he's sent east and paraded around as this captive noble savage, drawing massive crowds in cities like New York and Philadelphia. People were posing him for portraits and treating him like a literal celebrity. But meanwhile, back west, his defeat was being used as a terrifying catalyst to strip all the remaining tribes of their land. It was a massive display of absolute U.S. dominance.
By September of that year, the consequences were officially formalized. Even the tribes that had remained strictly neutral, or who had actually actively aided the U.S. during the conflict, were ultimately swept right up in President Andrew Jackson's aggressive Indian removal policies. The map was permanently altered. The Sauk and Meskwaki were forced to cede 6 million acres in eastern Iowa, which, ironically, was the exact territory they had just fled to, all for a mere $20,000 a year. The Ho-Chunk and Potawatomi, despite many of them trying so hard to stay out of the war entirely, were also pressured into signing massive land cessions shortly after. The resistance was effectively over, and the acceleration of westward expansion was completely unimpeded.
So, I'm going to leave you with this pretty provocative question to ponder about how we actually remember our own history. Think about it. We build statues of Black Hawk, we name sports teams and military helicopters after him today, but we really have to ask ourselves if this mythologizing is just a convenient way to comfort ourselves about the violent displacement that secured this land in the first place. I genuinely hope this explainer has given you a much deeper, more grounded understanding of the true cost of westward expansion. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive into the source material, and as always, keep questioning the history you think you know.